return. That's a lot of money to have to return to people. But just a tragic incident all around, and repercussions will still be coming in over that. But something that just FYI to folks who may have also had tickets like Wally and I did.
Yeah, and then at the there is much to come on the legal side, and at the pace that criminal things like this proceed. I'm sure we will be having dribs and drabs of this for many, many months to come.
Definitely. Now, Wally, I had the pleasure of speaking to the Rotary Club in Ruidoso, New Mexico, one of my favorite places around the state to visit. Beautiful up there in the mountains. It was a little bit windy both ways going down and back to Ruidoso yesterday, but a lot of fine folks down there to talk to. And of course, it's one of those more conservative areas of the state of New Mexico. Just a real pretty area and a great group to meet with, and a conservative area, and one of the more conservative areas that actually turned out at a decent level to in this last election. They turned out above the statewide average, unlike so many other conservative areas. So maybe something to be learned from those folks in Lincoln County. But really enjoy getting down there, and it's been since before COVID, so at least 2019, last time I made my way down to Ruidoso. When's the last time you were?
Wow, I was trying to think. So I think 6, 7 years. It has been a while. So yeah, I've spent a fair amount of time there, off and on. Great place. I've backpacked in the wilderness there, and back in the day, skied on the ice on bad snow years. But it is a beautiful area.
Yeah, they had 6 inches of snow prior to my visit, but a lot of it had melted, even though we haven't had exactly warm temperatures. But yeah, that sun comes out and it just melts it. But yeah, and those fires that they had a few years ago, I mean, it's amazing how nature continues to heal itself even when those intense fires burn through. So moving on to actual news items here this week. We talked about and gave kudos or props to the city of Albuquerque City Council for rejecting rent control legislation. Alas, the relatively sane city council of Albuquerque may be earned, if you will, by a law passed at the state level. Now, this particular law would relate to overturning a statewide ban on rent control. So, at some point in the past, some wise folks in the legislature decided that rent control was a really bad idea, and they were going to pass a statewide law to oppose it. Senator Linda Lopez has unwisely decided that she wants to introduce a bill to eliminate that ban. So, she would be setting the stage for local efforts to pass rent control, which is led by some kind of group called the People's Housing Project, who, whatever they think about housing, obviously doesn't understand basic economics. And, it's just unfortunate that every bad idea, and we kind of predicted at the time that we would hear more about this issue in the months and years ahead, given the trajectory of the legislature. So rent control legislation will be introduced in the 2023 session.
Yeah, and it's interesting if you understand supply, demand, pricing, and history. Rent control all has a very abysmal track record, and just think from the point of view of an apartment owner, they've invested money, and now the market can bear higher prices, but the government says no, that isn't the price. You can only charge this much. Just a little thought experiment. Does that make you more or less likely to invest in building apartments in the future if you know that you have that kind of overhang and uncertainty with regard to making money on your investment?
Yeah, and obviously, while the city of Albuquerque rejected this on a bipartisan basis, I might add, 7-2. So it wasn't just, the more conservative majority. They were joined by additional members of the city council. You just never know. There are a lot of left wing activist type groups that would love to get involved in rent control battle at a municipal level, and even if the city of Albuquerque was immune to that or stopped it, there's always Santa Fe, there's always Las Cruces, other places around the state certainly could fall prey to the siren song of rent control. So, and one of the so-called experts that was interviewed in a Channel 7 story said, it's not about rent control or not rent control. It's about giving local communities the choice over whether to adopt this. And, philosophically, I'm more of a statewide policy guy. That's for minimum wage. That's for a lot of regulations. I think we would be better off with one statewide policy. But I will remind folks that in 2019 and even 2018, the Rio Grande Foundation and a coalition of organizations got right to work passed in 11 of New Mexico's 33 counties. That was swiftly banned by the legislature in 2019. So, at least be consistent, at least somewhat consistent on this local versus statewide control thing. It would seem that you should at least, do things generally speaking at the statewide level, or be very liberal. I prefer statewide policy, especially on minimum wage.
Well, Paul, such a small-minded position, seeking consistency in policymaking. But the other thing I wanted to point out is, the city of Albuquerque is going the other way in terms of making it easier for housing and therefore encouraging more of it, doing things like allowing casitas, looking at some of their zoning, looking at some of their fee structure as a way to have there be more housing. And then you get this other group that has, kind of housing or whatever in their mission or their name is pushing back on policies that would, in all likelihood take the price and availability of housing in the places where it would be impacted the other way.
Yeah, and as the city of Albuquerque picks up steam with some of their reform ideas, I think it's going to be worth really unpacking some of those. And I have looked in a cursory manner at what they're doing, and by and large, it seems to be reasonably good. I do wish they would tackle direct regulations, both in terms of land use as well as there's just the permitting process. But something that we might want to have somebody involved in the home building industry on to discuss some of those issues that are a little beyond the scope of our typical work at the Rio Grande Foundation. You get into land use planning, zoning, and those kinds of things, not to mention permitting for building construction. It gets pretty wonky pretty quickly, but definitely some ways that the mayor could also, and mayor and city council here in Albuquerque could address the housing shortage. I see no signs of Santa Fe doing anything to address those issues, and I don't know to the extent that Las Cruces has a problem with housing. And rent is going up for everybody because inflation is going up for everybody. But here in Albuquerque and certainly in Santa Fe, there are unique challenges. People think of wide open spaces here in the West, but certainly Albuquerque, relatively limited land to build on. And a lot of what needs to be done is redeveloping existing tracts of land, and that can be a challenge. So I had a opinion piece that ran in several newspapers across the state, including the Las Cruces Sun News, where I have a monthly column that runs, and asked some questions about kind of where things are heading here in New Mexico. Most of this is, of course, for the Democrats who control virtually every aspect of New Mexico government. So PNM, they have repeatedly said, guys, we're not going to have enough electricity come the heat of May and June. I told Ronchetti personally when he was on the campaign trail that if he was elected, that would have to be one of his very, very top issues. I've seen no signs, no indications that Governor Lujan Grisham has made keeping the lights on next summer a priority. I'm actually sitting down with PNM here in the near future to discuss this issue, so I may have more information after that. But I think it's critical that something is done sooner than later to address the electricity situation with the shuttering of San Juan Generating Station and the lack of electricity on the grid. But next question was the PRC, also related. The governor is going to be able to name the PRC 3 members, no longer the 5 elected across the state due to the constitutional amendment passed last election. Are these going to be at her beck and call? Is there going to be ideological diversity in the PRC? And, generally speaking, is she going to be able to kind of put these people under her thumb? 3, New Mexico is just one of 11 states in a COVID emergency. Is the legislature going to continue to go along with that? Technically, Lujan Grisham is a lame duck. She can't run for re-election. Maybe some Democrats in the legislature will decide that one-person rule on COVID is not a great idea. And education spending, with both Amendment 1 and the massive surplus that is available to the legislature, when is enough in terms of the education spending that the state does, considering our results? And, will we see some tax cuts? I know that may be an optimistic thing, but I was actually listening to Bob Clark on KKOB, and he had Jason Harper, who's now in House Republican leadership. And Harper was rather optimistic about gross receipts tax reform. Now, Jason Harper and you and I on the gross receipts tax resemble Charlie Brown, and the Democrats often resemble Lucy in the whole football charade.
It seems like of the 5 people who even care about this issue anymore, 2 of them are on this podcast right now.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show, Paul, how public policy things that can have dramatic impacts, if they don't have what I call baby seal appeal, you know what I mean? A kind of a warm, soft, fuzzy constituency, it's sometimes hard to get them moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I definitely want your input on any or all of those questions. But I did have one point for Republicans is, we've talked about the really abysmal turnout among more conservative areas of New Mexico. And what is the GOP, what are conservatives going to do? I know the first step in that is getting a new chairman. That's going to be discussed at the Republican Party this weekend. Real quickly, I did some research for another interview I did and noted that in 2020, turnout statewide, that's the presidential election, of re-election of Donald Trump. Of course, he did not get re-elected. It was Joe Biden. But statewide turnout was 68.67%. In Lee County, which underperformed the most of all the conservative counties, that's the Hobbs area, 55.89% in 2020. So even when Trump was on the ballot in 2020, Lee County was a 13-point underperformer in terms of turnout relative to the state. Now, Eddy County was right at the statewide level, 67.31. That's Carlsbad and Artesia. Then Chavez County was a little bit down at 64%. 2016, so this is Trump's election against Hillary Clinton, turnout was 62.36% statewide. Lee County, again, underperformed, this time by 8 percentage points, 52.5. Eddy County outperformed, 63.79. Chavez County slightly underperformed, 60.39. So especially Lee County, this problem seems to be a long-term situation for Republicans underperforming. But in general, I think better get out the vote efforts, getting voters in the Southeast and the most conservative areas of our state ginned up to go out and turn out is pretty critical. But on the PNM, PRC, education, any of those issues, feel free to fire away there, Wally.
Well, they are all, when you were going through the list of those asking the questions, it reminded me of the old soap opera cliffhangers. It's like, what will happen? New Mexico is way, way out in front of the Green New Deal with its fixed dates and turning things off more quickly than is required at the federal level, and even in some ways more than many, many other liberal states. And so we're kind of out there hanging on our own. I think it was always going to be problematic, and then you throw COVID in, it makes it even more difficult. And so rather than delaying a few things or taking a fresh look at it, they're like, no, we got to do this. And yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens and what PNM's plans really are. But I watched the hearing where PNM and the other New Mexico utilities that are regulated by the PRC talk about their power plans for next year, and boy, it does not give you a warm and fuzzy feeling. And we have another issue. California, Paul, they're now used to horrendous electric service that's very intermittent, and they've adjusted to that. One thing I will say about PNM is their reliability, generation transmission at the distribution level has been absolutely fantastic in recent years. And so there's a lot of people that, require electricity for oxygen generators, other things at home that maybe haven't even felt the need to invest in backup plans or intermittent systems. And, you're supposed to, if you're on those things, you're supposed to. But the lights just stay on. They have just stayed on. And if we're going to move into a time that doesn't, it creates all kinds of economic problems. But I think in New Mexico, and at least in PNM service territory, the transition to unreliability may be even worse because it has been so good. And so we'll see what happens. COVID certainly threw a monkey wrench into a lot of these plans in terms of supply chains, but these aren't going away anytime soon, no matter what you're doing. And so it's easy to turn off a power plant, next to impossible or very difficult to turn it back on. And it's not easy to get all of the equipment you need because what do you call a power plant that's 99.9% completed, Paul? How much power does it provide? And the answer is zero, and that is the issue. You have to have every bit of it as you add new generation to make this thing work.
Yeah, and just this morning in the Albuquerque Journal, there was an article about the fact that electric vehicle charging stations are apparently prone to being hacked, which is something I hadn't even contemplated. I'm maybe a little less tech savvy than some other folks, so of my age group. But geez, that's just wild that you could have a charging station hacked, by computer hackers. And Trevor, the cartoonist for the Albuquerque Journal, who, whenever I'm doing public talks, like I did in Ruidoso yesterday, Farmington last week, I always make sure to I have several Trevor cartoons in my PowerPoint deck because he really captures, I think, so much of what we talk about at the Rio Grande Foundation. And one of his recent cartoons was two Democrats on the back of a train. Well, donkeys, symbol of the Democratic Party, of course. A clean sweep, 4 more years of progress. The other says, any idea how we can gerrymander the education scores? And it's, one car is Louisiana 49th, Alaska 50th, New Mexico 51st, the caboose. And that obviously is symbolic of our education position. Another recent Trevor cartoon is some trapeze artists, and they're talking about, well, we're making this transition to the new guy who's not as reliable, and it's wind and solar, and he's sitting there on the other trapeze when the lady's already made the transition, so to speak. She's out in space, hanging out there, supported by nothing but air, and the other form of energy that she's supposed to be caught by is playing on his cell phone. So Trevor does a great job, really, with some of these issues. And something that might be a future Trevor cartoon, because Wally, rarely does a scandal break immediately after a vote on an issue that we say, I told you so.
Right.
It took a while for us to really figure out that the spaceport was a boondoggle. I mean, we kind of knew that the rail runner was a boondoggle, but there haven't been any specific scandals. It was just baked into the way those things were presented. And the more people found out about them, the more they realized, we've been taken to the cleaners yet again. You would think people would eventually learn their lesson, but unfortunately, it seems like learning lessons is kind of, we're a hell of a lot more immune to that than we are to COVID in this state. But Larry Barker, the dean of the investigative journalist community, and I write about this at Errors of Enchantment as I have about the other items. So get this, Wally. So City of Albuquerque requests money through the capital outlay process. So they have legislators representing the city of Albuquerque, and they ask for capital outlay dollars, kind of vague language, facilities in Albuquerque, et cetera, et cetera.
For the children.
Yeah, for the children, right. And they get a couple $100,000 through the capital outlay process. And then throw some city money at it themselves. And what do we get for that money? Well, that money actually went to fund a new turf field for the Duke City Gladiators, who...
Good, go so far.
Much like the New York Giants and New York Jets, do not play in New York City or New York State.
The New York Giants of New Jersey. And so where are the Duke City Gladiators?
In Rio Rancho at the erstwhile Rio Rancho Star Center. I think it's the Rio Rancho Event Center now. Not just in Rio Rancho, but if you've ever been there, it's quite a ways into Rio Rancho.
It's in City Center, which is a long way from where most of the city is.
Yeah, so the city of Albuquerque, according to Mr. Barker, spent $239,622 to fund a turf field for a team that does not even play in the city of Albuquerque. And that's obviously a problem. You tend to think that money either indirectly from the state that's passed through the city of Albuquerque in terms of capital outlay, or money collected from the citizens of Albuquerque would be used in Albuquerque, but not in this particular case. And then the article also notes that, yes, this is public money being used for direct benefit of a private interest, aka the Gladiators, and that violates the anti-donation clause of the state constitution, which, despite our efforts to the contrary,
has been amended.
Yeah, and our admonitions on voting on Amendment 2 that we said you shouldn't do that, the voters overwhelmingly went along with Amendment 2, and now allowing at a vote of 65 to 35%. So that's a butt kicking in any election. A yes vote, according to Ballotpedia and according to information on Amendment 2, supported authorizing the legislature to appropriate state funds for infrastructure that provides services primarily for residential use, such as internet, electric, natural gas, wastewater, and water, to private entities. So, this seems like a rare double scandal in the sense that it's both a use of city tax dollars for a project outside of the city, and then a anti-donation clause concern where you're using those tax dollars for private benefit. And of course, an amendment. We don't know what the enabling legislation will look like when the legislature will pass it in Santa Fe this year. But it's definitely, it highlights, I think, all of our concerns about legitimating and legalizing those kinds of uses of our tax dollars. So,
Yeah, and Paul, I would just say to the first 2 points, I think you're spot on. Those are both issues, and to add insult to injury is the whole issue that the capital outlay process in Santa Fe is abysmal.
right.
That and I'm not minimizing the first two, but you put those with the basically divvy it up and put it on a bunch of half baked projects where we have, the last I heard, I haven't looked at this recently, there was like $1 billion of unspent allocated capital funds that aren't doing anybody any good, so it's like, what would the preference be is to reduce taxes by putting those monies back to the citizens of Albuquerque? But if you're going to have money that's allocated for capital, building capital is better than just having it allocated to nowhere. And that process is really bad. And that's something else. As we get more and more money, there's going to be a lot of ever more fraud, waste, and abuse. It's one of those. And believe me, the band of whatever small town that gets capital outlay for their band uniforms, I mean, good for them getting those. But, in terms of what the state ought to be investing in from a infrastructure and a project point of view, if it's going to spend these capital funds, is been a little bit suspect under our capital allocation process that we use in Santa Fe.
Yeah, I guess it really does come down to three strikes. You have the misuse of City of Albuquerque tax dollars, you have the anti-donation clause, and you have the very poorly designed is such a nice word for it. The very
it's emerged more than designed, but yes, it is
haphazard capital
haphazard.
outlay process of the state of New Mexico, and they're all in this case intertwined. And we, of course, and pretty much anyone across the spectrum that looks at New Mexico's capital outlay process says this is a disaster. And yet again, we see that in this particular case.
And Paul, I would say, and this is not meant as a flippant comment. I don't think it would be tough to design a worse process if your goal was to design a bad process. That's how bad that one is. But boy, it reminds me to use a quick metaphor. Is like, when you're the parent of children, food, shelter, clothing, education, all of that. Our capital outlay program is like flippant grandparents that are buying expensive, seldom used toys a lot of times, not really investing in
hitting home there at Christmas time.
Oh, I'm sorry, but it's one of those. There is a role for that, but we use meat and potatoes amounts of money on what are really condiment style projects. So
wow. Oh, that's a metaphor mashup of potato-like proportions. Yes, all that Wally said and so much more. So it's it's one of those scandals. When I read through it, I saw, first and foremost, kudos to Mr. Barker. Secondly, this really hits on so many issues that the Rio Grande Foundation covers. I knew we would have a nice conversation about it, something we'll probably be talking about again, like some of the other issues that we discuss on this show. Now, I was doing, sometimes I come up with new things for this show based on presentations I make and points I'm trying to make in these presentations I give around the state. And with the election over with, it didn't really completely overhaul my presentation, because when I go to speak to different groups, I talk about tax reform, which I still believe, and based on Harper's remarks, that the gross receipts tax is absolutely something that can and should still be undertaken. The question is, of course, do we just get a rate cut, which is welcome, but not really solving the problem, or do we actually address the fundamental pyramiding and that whole problem? And then the education system, which, of course, as I raised in my op-ed, are we going to just pour money into education, or are we going to actually achieve education reform and results? and I've been using, these NAEP scores, National Assessment of Educational Progress, that came out in October. Uh, you know, it's unfortunate they didn't come out in September, because I would have, if I were advising Ron Ketty, I would have just made that my whole campaign. I would have just absolutely gone after the governor. Uh, I'm kind of surprised they still didn't, but anyway, the outcomes, so to speak, were horrible. And Arizona, comparing their fourth grade reading scores with New Mexico's, I've never done much comparison of New Mexico and Arizona, because Arizona has been a leader in education reform for years, and New Mexico has been a laggard. But it is worth noting that as recently as 2007, New Mexico outperformed Arizona in fourth grade reading. Of course, you're either reading to learn pre fourth grade, or you're reading to learn after fourth grade. You're learning to read before fourth grade. You're really building that skill so that you can use it throughout all your other disciplines in education. And in 2007, New Mexico fourth graders scored 212. In Arizona, they only scored 210. That quickly, those results started to dry up, and by the time 2022 rolled around, New Mexico was down 10 points to 202, whereas Arizona is up to 215. So slow and steady progress in Arizona. And it just hits the issue of, are we going to continue just what we've done? Back to Gary Johnson, Susana Martinez, and other governors pouring money into education, or are we going to actually reform the system? And I've seen nothing out of the current governor that indicates she's going to do anything besides continue to pour money into the education system, which leads me to data from Statista. Now, education funding per pupil is something that is notoriously hard to track down. I don't think the Census Bureau does the job, but Statista fiscal year 2022 data on education spending. They find New York spends about $30,000. District of Columbia, $23,679. You go down to 19th position, which is still above the national average. New Mexico, $15,338 per student. So we're above the national average. We're firmly in the upper echelon of states in terms of education spending. And need I remind you that we are at the very bottom of every single category in the NAEP scores. Now, what states are at the bottom? How much do they spend? Believe it or not, Idaho, $8,662. Not too far off of half.
Yeah.
Utah, $8,894. Mississippi, which we've discussed, about a third, $10,089. So they are spending a third less, I should say, not a third, but 2/3 of what we spend, and yet they've seen very positive education results. Arizona, $10,639. So again, Arizona spending about 2/3 of what we spend per student, outperforming us. Of course, everybody in the country is outperforming us. That kind of goes without saying. The point is that it's not a money situation. Yes, money helps, but money maybe could help, I should say. But money is not what is driving these states, including, but by no means limited to, Mississippi and Arizona, to educational success. Because I will also note that Florida, which is in many ways the poster child of pro market, if you will, pro choice education reform, $10,890 per student, and Florida's not going to cover off the ball. So it's not what New Mexico has been doing for the last couple of decades has not worked out. But again, I think we're going to get more of the same.
I hope not. And as you were talking, Paul, I was just think about what New Mexico would look like if, instead of 19th in spending per student, we were 19th in educational attainment, or heck, even 25th. I'll give them a few points. If we were right there in the middle instead of at the very end, what a fantastic positive impact that would have on the state of New Mexico, both the students who would have more education, as well as the businesses, government, the state, how everything would be improved. And an interesting thought experiment. I'm with you though. We have too much money. We have too much money to fight about in this session to go after something as tough as educational reform.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we had even a mixed environment up there, by mixed, I mean, uh, Republicans and Democrats, I think you could see. And this is what Gary Johnson, from my understanding, I was not at the Rio Grande Foundation, but this is something that kind of was a failure, if you will, of the Johnson administration, is that he wanted very much essentially a voucher program. Vouchers being one form of school choice. Of course, they were popular. When Johnson was governor, there's been numerous other approaches tried, and some successfully politically, some haven't gotten much traction. But the fact remains is that Gary Johnson was not given his education reforms. All we got was more spending, which obviously failed. Now, I believe Gary Johnson saw the passage of charter schools, which is a positive reform. Of course, that wasn't nearly the push in those days that private, school choice is or was. That's always been a very difficult push, but charter schools used to have much more bipartisan support. Now, that is pretty much the area where we're all fighting over here in New Mexico in 2019. Lujan Grisham came in and really had the intention of undermining our charter schools in New Mexico. Hopefully, she's learned her lesson on that, because she got bipartisan pushback. But I sincerely expect that we'll have some discussions, some challenges facing charter schools in the months and years ahead, at least the next 4 years. So, if we had a Republican governor with a ascending number of Republicans in the legislature, perhaps a more politically savvy Ron Ketty could have achieved some kind of compromise involving choice in education. But, he certainly was already, even during the campaign, getting plenty of pushback from the establishment. They made what I thought was a, quite frankly, disappointing education reform agenda that he put forth with really no, he sat in this room and told us, and I'm not going to criticize Ron Ketty, but there's no benefit to not speaking publicly about this because he lost the race. He said directly that he supports the money following the student, and really what he put into his plan was what I would consider very weak tea, some tutoring money, et cetera, but got plenty of pushback nonetheless. Anytime you take a dime out of the traditional union-dominated school system, you are going to get holy hell upon your head. And Ron Ketty, even with the relatively weak tea that he was putting forth, continued to get that pushback.
Yes, and one of the things about progressive policies is the progressive policy is we need more money for our teachers. The union teachers need more money. It's like, fine. But the thing that never gets baked into these policies is it working, and is it doing what we need to do? And this is a question. The answer, and my answer, I'll give you my answer to my question is no for this session. But at some point, I do believe that the Democrats of New Mexico, given that they have such a huge majority, they will own the education problem. It will be put at their feet for them to do something about. And we'll see if anything happens. I'm with you. It may go the other way this session in terms of some of the gains that have been made in school choice, charter schools, and the other things, because it seems to be very, very, very much driven by teacher union preferences, not what's helping students get education. So,
yeah, well, we will leave it there. We will certainly be talking about the upcoming session and future conversations. But thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.